No one knew her name. With her old trench coat and worn-out shoes, when she entered the room, everyone ignored her. "She must have come by mistake," they whispered. But the reason she had come wasn't to find a seat. She had come to take back her past. Please don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The door opened quietly. The crowd, under the crystal chandeliers of the large hall, clinked their wine glasses gently, but no one turned to look at the woman who had entered. She wore a long, simple trench coat. Her hair was neatly gathered but not styled with care. Her shoes were old, the soles a bit worn down. There was no necklace around her neck, no diamonds in her ears. To the glittering faces of the art world, she was just a shadow, someone who had been invited by mistake, maybe even a cleaner. The ticket checker at the entrance avoided eye contact as she checked her ticket. It was as if her presence was a stain that would ruin the aesthetic fabric of this luxurious place. The woman didn't speak to anyone. She simply walked towards an empty chair and sat down. Among the other participants, in their tuxedos, expensive dresses, and silk scarves, she seemed to disappear. Whispers started to spread. "Who is she?" some asked. A few rolled their eyes, while others made sure she wasn't in any of the exclusive invitation shots they shared on social media. With her humble appearance and still gaze, she wasn't part of any of the extravagant conversations that swirled around the room. But she hadn't come for that. When the auctioneer struck his gavel on the table, the room fell silent. The first piece was announced, an abstract painting with a gold-leafed frame. The artist was praised, and long speeches were given about the aesthetic value of the painting. The woman turned her eyes to the top corner of the painting. There, almost erased, was a detail, an unmistakable sign for anyone who knew who had painted it. And she knew, because she had once framed that painting with her own hands. Because that painting had been stolen from her house years ago. But no one knew that. No one whispered her name. None of the portraits on the walls of the room seemed to care about her. But the woman looked around, as if facing each one of them. This auction wasn't just a night for selling art pieces. It was a night when a woman, who had been tried to be forgotten for years, quietly walked into her own past. And for the first time, she would be noticed not because she was silent, but because, despite being silent, she remained strong. The auctioneer announced the price. Bids rose from all sides of the room. 100,000, 150,000, 200,000. The woman, sitting silently at the back, lifted her head but did not place a bid. It wasn't time yet. Her arrival wasn't for a purchase, but for a claim. She pulled an old notebook out of her bag. From the yellowed pages, a letter and a few photos fell out. And in that moment, she felt the first spark of a fire that had been burning inside her for years. That painting wasn't just a piece of art. It was the silent scream of a dream destroyed years ago, a stolen inheritance, the silenced cry of a little girl. And now that scream was about to echo through the walls of this hall. No one knew her name, but soon everyone would be talking about her past. Because sometimes the simplest-looking women carry the most complicated secrets. As the auction went on, the atmosphere in the room grew even more intense. The prices were rising, excitement building, and the collectors were engaging in a polite yet ruthless battle against each other. Every piece was a new argument, a new gossip, but the woman sitting in the back remained completely still. There wasn't the slightest shift in her face. It was as if she didn't belong to this world, or perhaps she had once belonged and then been cast aside. Every now and then, she glanced at the notebook in front of her, her fingers tracing the edges of the pages. Each touch seemed to awaken an old memory. Her mind traveled back 20 years. She had been just 17, the quiet, shy daughter of a painter mother who worked late into the night with her brushes. Her hands were stained with paint, her face marked with smudges. But the one thing she had most was hope in her eyes. The small studio where she lived with her mother was heaven to her. The walls were worn, the ceiling leaked, but there was art in that home. There were stories, there were colors, and dreams. Then, one day, those dreams were stolen. She still couldn't forget that evening. The door had been forced open. The men who entered the studio were wearing masks, but one of them seemed familiar to her. She couldn't scream. Her mother had already been silenced. The artworks were ripped off the walls, the notebooks burned, the brushes thrown on the floor. And that painting, yes, the one being sold on stage now, it was her mother's last work. What burned the woman inside wasn't just the theft of the art, but the erasure of the silence her mother had left behind. There were no official records after that night. The studio was accidentally burned down in a fire, and the women vanished. The little girl sent to the orphanage had remained silent for years. Neither the authorities nor her relatives had listened to her. "Your imagination's too vivid," they had said. But she hadn't forgotten anything. Not the faces, not the voices, not the stolen colors. And now, years later, that silent child, that nameless woman, had returned. There was a stir in the room. The third piece was brought up. Broken lights. The woman's eyes widened. She was seeing this painting for the first time, but the style, the brushstrokes, the color transitions, everything seemed to have been made by her mother. But upon closer inspection, the piece had been copied, altered by someone. It was a forgery, but for anyone who knew the original, it was impossible to hide the truth. The woman pulled a folder from her bag. She took out a photograph, an old Polaroid. It had faded lettering on it, Studio 2002. In the photo, her mother was smiling as she hung that painting on the wall behind her. This was the evidence, the proof, but it wasn't the right time yet. If she used this moment wrong, she might not even make it out of the room. For the first time, she lifted her head and looked toward the stage. She locked eyes with someone sitting directly across. It was a man who used to visit her mother's studio frequently in his youth, a collector. He didn't care about the art, only the profit. The woman's memories flashed her mother arguing with him. One night crying with papers in her hands, and the next morning, her mother was dead. The man didn't recognize her. He wouldn't remember. They always forgot. But the forgotten ones never forget. In that moment, the woman made her decision. This war wouldn't just be about stolen paintings. It would be about the stolen silence as well. Her mother's name would be remembered with her works, and that silenced little girl would no longer just watch, but speak. And very soon, everyone in the room would know her name and want to learn her past. Because in this story, the roles were changing. The silent ones would speak, and the imposters would fall silent. As the gazes among the crowd mixed with the excitement of the auction, the silent woman remained completely still. The storm inside her didn't show in her eyes, but a rebellion had long since risen in her heart. With every piece that was sold, it felt as though another piece of her past was being stolen. The years she had been silent, ashamed of them, were now being replaced by the fire of another emotion. Righteous anger. The woman opened a page in her notebook. On that page, in her mother's handwriting, was a note. Art is not only the reflection of what is seen, it is also the mirror of the hidden truth. And one day, those who look into this mirror will see themselves. Most of the pieces had already been sold. As the fourth painting was brought up, the woman slowly closed the notebook. This painting was different from the others. It was titled Crack Time. But in her mind, another name echoed, Broken Times. Her mother had never finished this painting, and now it seemed completed. But every line, every color, it felt like it had been finished by someone else's hand. The truth was hidden beneath the aesthetic. It was like trying to conceal a wound with foundation. The surface looked beautiful, but beneath it, it was still bleeding. As the auctioneer spoke, the woman stood up for the first time. The crowd noticed her. Heads turned toward her, and there were expressions of surprise mixed with mockery. Among the looks that wondered, "What is this woman doing?" The former collector, who was trying to act like he didn't know her, shifted in his seat slightly. It was as though he had sensed that this silent figure was drawing a little too much attention. Instead of walking toward the stage, the woman moved toward one of the side tables. There, a small catalog was placed, a brochure with short descriptions of the works being auctioned. She quickly flipped through the pages and found the painting titled Crack Time. The description read, "Believed to be the legacy of an unidentified artist. This abstract piece, woven with lines symbolizing the loneliness of the modern age, is being presented for the first time at this auction. Unidentified, the woman felt a burning sensation at the bridge of her nose. She knew who that artist was, because she was the one who had held his hand in his final moments. The real meaning of this painting was far more than what was written in that catalog. Her mother had created this piece to leave her story behind. And now, her name erased, the painting was being sold as a discovery by another man. The woman pulled an old notebook from her bag. Inside were her mother's sketches, the first drafts of that very painting, color plans, notes with dates. She wanted to walk up to the stage and show it to everyone, to shout out the truth. But a voice inside her said, "Not now." This wasn't just a moment for an outburst, it had to be a moment of complete destruction. Because this lie had been built over decades. To tear it down, she didn't need a hammer. She needed a plan. Just then, a woman curator, standing in the corner of the room, gave her attention. They locked eyes. The curator nodded slightly, almost as if greeting her. Did she recognize her? Or was it just a courtesy? A feeling inside the woman whispered that this glance was no mere coincidence. Perhaps she wasn't alone. Maybe someone else had started to realize that those paintings were fake, that the nameless woman had a connection to the past. But this was just the beginning. Because the revenge of the silent ones wouldn't be taken with a single sentence, it would be taken with evidence, names, and revealed secrets. And those secrets would no longer remain locked inside the notebook. Amid the murmur of the crowd, the woman sat back down. But this time, loneliness didn't envelop her. It was as if the air in the room had changed. Some eyes were now fixed on her, and some whispers were directly aimed at her. That old, unseen version of herself was beginning to crack. From within the shadows, a true figure was slowly emerging. Yet, she remained silent, because she knew the power of words would explode when the right moment came. She carefully returned the notebook to her bag. Her eyes shifted toward the curator. She was still standing in the same corner, but this time, she was talking to someone, a young man, holding a digital tablet. The brief exchange between them wasn't clear, but when the woman pointed directly to where she sat with her index finger, everything became apparent. Someone had noticed her. Maybe someone had recognized her. At that moment, for the first time in years, she didn't feel alone. Just then, the next painting was unveiled on the stage. The woman left in the shadows. The crowd went silent. The visual power of the painting was mesmerizing. Among the gray tones, a faint female face emerged. Her gaze blurred, her features veiled in shadows. But when the woman saw this painting, she felt as if she couldn't breathe. This was her painting. It was the first piece she had ever created, drawn when she was just 18. After it disappeared, she hadn't seen it again. It was the purest, most fragile creation, made to tell her mother, "I can do this too." But here, it was listed under a completely different name. With the fake biography of an invented artist, it had been placed into a fabricated past. Beside the painting, there was a small info card, created by the mysterious young artist Lorian, whose identity has never been revealed. The art community believes this name is a metaphor. The woman stood up, this time not silently, but consciously and deliberately. She didn't walk to the front of the painting. Instead, she moved toward a panel on the back wall that no one had paid attention to before. There, detailed information and past catalogs about the artists were displayed. She examined one document, a catalog from 2003. It was the first time the name Lorian appeared. But upon closer inspection, many of the sketches used in the drawings were identical to the sketches in her mother's notebook. This fabricated name was a mask stolen from her past. The woman quickly snapped a few photos with her phone. Then, she took out the comparison page from her notebook and wrote down some notes. The evidence was no longer just in memories, it was in the documents now. But the real question was, who was the person behind this forgery? That man. Yes, the one sitting in the front row of the hall now, wearing a gray suit, shaking hands with everyone with a polite smile. He had once come to their studio, pretending to be a lover of art, only to disappear the next night. Now, he was the king of this counterfeit empire. At that moment, a young man came over to her, the same person who had been talking to the curator. He leaned in and whispered, "We'd like you to step outside soon. We have something to show you." But quietly, the woman nodded. She clutched the notebook tightly in her hands. The revenge she had waited for hours to start had begun this night. But this wasn't just anger that would explode on stage. This was a reckoning that had been built with years of patience. And the most shocking part of this reckoning had yet to take the stage. The woman silently stood up and moved toward the heavy velvet curtains at the back of the auction hall. No one looked back. Most were still focused on the price of the next piece. But her mind was already outside this room. She had imagined this moment for years, and now, fate's elegant yet sharp hands were pulling her behind the scenes. The curator and the young man were waiting for her in the adjoining corridor. "Follow us," the woman said, her voice low but determined. Together, the three of them walked down the corridor and stopped in front of a small security door. The young man scanned his card, and the door beeped open. Inside, there was only a table and a few files. But the air inside, it belonged to another time. As soon as the woman stepped inside, her eyes scanned the drawings on the walls. Most of them closely resembled the sketches her mother had made years ago. But underneath them was another name, Lorien. This fake name had now been engraved not just on the artworks, but on an entire legacy. The young man opened one of the files and carefully placed it in front of her. "These are digital records of works that were auctioned over the last 5 years. We've noticed some inconsistencies in the style, techniques used, and pigment analysis. Some of them appear to be much older." And the woman's eyes locked onto the document. Some of these works are from a private collection that was reported lost in the early 2000s. What's more, they've all been recatalogued under the same name, Lorien. The woman held her breath. These documents were powerful enough to prove not only her personal past but also a huge forgery in art history. But there was still one missing piece: the face behind this operation. The curator took off her glasses and spoke slowly. "I think I met you years ago. I can't remember your name, but I remember your mother. We met in a small, humble studio. Back then, this man hadn't risen to prominence yet. But I always had the feeling that he was a dangerous person." The woman swallowed hard. "My name is Elena. My mother was Marta." The curator closed her eyes, as if paying respect to the ghost of the past. "Then seeing you here isn't just fate. This hall has been glorifying his fake fame for years. But perhaps, tonight, it's time to drop that mask." Elena lowered her head. In that moment, the little girl inside her felt for the first time that she was being embraced. The young man added, "We have an idea. The final piece in today's auction is going to be a special one: the Backyard of Loneliness. We have a suspicious document regarding this piece, and it almost perfectly matches a drawing from your notebook. If you reveal the evidence on stage in front of everyone, you can silence him there." Elena focused on the document. The drawing carried a note, written in her mother's handwriting. "Let this be the last one. Don't let them silence me." At that moment, everything became clear. The years the silent woman had spent in silence were now forcing her to speak. Because this silence wasn't just a personal pain, it was a societal echo. And to be the voice of that echo, she would return to that room. But this time, not silently, this time as the voice of truth in front of everyone. The hall was almost full now. When the final piece was announced, the lights were dimmed a bit more, and an air of mysterious curiosity filled the room. Most of the guests thought the next piece would be the peak of an impressive collection. Whispers increased. Some were saying, "This is going to break a new record," while others added, "Lorien will surprise us again." How curious it was, everyone still hadn't realized that this fictional name had no real body behind it. The auctioneer stepped onto the stage. He struck the gavel once. "Ladies and gentlemen, our final piece of the night, the Backyard of Loneliness." The curtain rose. The painting was emotionally striking. An abandoned playground, a woman's silhouette half hidden in shadows, and faint distant lights. When Elena saw it for the first time, she could barely swallow, because she had sat in that park many times beside her mother. And that silhouette of the woman, it was a perfect replica of her mother's youth. As everyone in the hall admired the painting, Elena took the microphone handed to her by the curator. The room was silent. Everyone was waiting for a new introduction or a collector's commentary. But no one had expected this simple, unknown woman to walk up to the stage. Elena took the microphone in her hand. Before the gavel could strike again, her voice was heard. "I know the person who painted this, because I painted it." A murmur spread through the room. The auctioneer stepped back. Grumbles began in the crowd. Some said, "Who is this?" while others began pulling out their phones. The woman on stage remained calm. She was just going to tell the truth. She was simply going to break the silence. This piece was stolen years ago, just like many of the works being sold here tonight. And they all came from an artist named Marta, or those who worked in her studio. The owners were silenced, their names erased. But today, this painting called me here, because the layers that have been erased still carry my mother's brushstrokes. The curator stepped forward and handed out documents supporting Elena's words. Old photographs, pigment analyses, sketches that matched perfectly. The young man projected scanned notes from Elena's notebook onto the screen. In front of everyone, the A. Lorien's signature began to fade. The truth became visible. And the man in the front row, the collector, the one who had started it all years ago, he couldn't stand anymore. His face had turned ghostly pale. Cameras from every direction were now focused on him. A few guests began to confront him, their whispers turning into direct questions. "Was it you? Is this your forgery? Did you sell lies with our money?" Suddenly, the auctioneer dropped the microphone. The gavel hit the floor. The stage was in chaos. But something had finally fallen into place. Elena's identity. A round of applause began from somewhere in the crowd. First one person, then another, then the entire hall. Amidst the false glitter of the years, a true star had emerged from the silence. That night, Elena took back not only a painting but also her mother's name, her own story, and a voice that had been suppressed for years. The press exploded the next day with the headline, "The Nameless Woman Shattered the Art World." An investigation was launched against the collector. The auction house issued an apology, and Elena was no longer just someone living in the shadow of the past. She was now the silent revolutionary of art history. If the story moved you, keep listening to the stories of the unseen. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel.